So now it's my pleasure to introduce Sue Schran. As you heard earlier, Suze is a patient herself and a patient engagement engineer with a health and disability law and policy background. She's the founder and CEO of Expect, a patient engagement do tank, which focuses on driving greater partnership with patient experts and leaders across the healthcare ecosystem. And she was previously the director of patient engagement at the Arthritis Foundation and the deputy director of patient engagement for the patient-centered Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute. Thank you. Suze?
Thank you so much, Eleanor, and thank you all for joining today. It's great to have so many folks on the line to share this work. I'm going to share a little bit about sort of how we envision the role of use cases in the blueprint, and then, as Dr. Buffetto just shared, outline the use case that is currently embedded in the blueprint. So if we go to the next slide. You know, pilot cases were always part of the plan, most likely in the later phase, sort of after the blueprint was largely assembled. But as we were building out the blueprint, it became really clear that we needed something embedded within the blueprint right off the bat, even if it's not a PC-CIS per se, because obviously those don't exist yet. But this was important for a few reasons. First, just to provide some tangible examples of what these activities might look like at each step, to move from conceptual or theoretical down to practical, but also to help blueprint users really see themselves in this process, make it clear that it is possible to do, and that there are folks who have done work similar to this. And these use cases can almost serve as an invitation to create a PC-CIS. So let's look at the next slide. Thankfully, the Arthritis Foundation and Anna Hyde in particular were gracious enough to let us feature one of their initiatives called the Live Yes Insights program. Insights, if you're not familiar, is a community-based PRO collection program. The idea is to capture trends and themes and symptomology and needs across the arthritis community outside of the clinical setting, and importantly, outside of pure clinical outcomes. So you can see why this was such a great fit for a use case in the creation of the blueprint. The idea is really to capture that entire experience of living with and treating diseases. While the program did, of course, not produce a PC-CIS, what it did do was rely on patients as leaders and partners from ideation all the way to rollout, and now in ongoing upkeep and modification. As you have seen or will see in the blueprint, we describe what took place during the creation of insights at each corresponding step in the blueprint. And so what you see on the slide here is that same table of contents you might be familiar with by now, starting right from the beginning. So before the Arthritis Foundation even began work on the project, the first step was to test the idea with the patient community. Is this idea the way we want to go? Is this going to answer problems and be valuable to us as a community? Who should be involved? How should patients be integrated throughout? So all of those critical factors that occur in the planning and really scoping out a project happened right up front and happened in true partnership and leadership with patients. In the first data gathering step, where the goal is to capture the data that has already been collected, if there is any, from and about the patient community, and then to evaluate it to see if it was collected in a patient-centered way. Well, in the Insights program, there was a fair bit of already collected data. Just from the many, many options, there were already 2 patient-focused drug development initiatives. There was a PCORI-funded engagement award that involved 20 listening sessions, countless pieces of data from years of events and conferences. And the team building out Insights could feel pretty confident about how that data was collected and that it truly reflected the lived experience of the patient community. As you heard Dr. Buffetto say a moment ago, that evaluation of the existing data, making sure that it truly captures what patients care about, not what other stakeholder types may have said on behalf of patients. That's a really key step. And in the case of insights, these previous data collection steps were quite robust and quite authentic. In the first prioritization step of the blueprint, we again link to the analogous step in the creation of insights. And in that case, patients were involved in selecting which aspects of disease and treatment were really most important to measure. And that was before beginning to explore the other stakeholder data. In the case of insights, existing research and existing core outcome sets, there's so much rich research and literature on arthritis, but that was the second data gathering phase. And then in the second phase of prioritization, patients and clinicians discussing and selecting potential additional items for consideration, but carefully not losing any of the things patients had prioritized as important to collect. And then finally, in terms of sort of telling the story of the creation of the Insights program, this maps really beautifully to the assembling of the PC-CIS and the blueprint. It's been captured in journal articles. The story has been told widely across the arthritis community about how this program came to fruition, what the steps were. And so it just really lent itself well. Of course, not each body of activity is a perfect fit. And if you've already gone through the blueprint and through the use case, you'll see that. But it certainly helps to contextualize how a patient advocacy organization or other end user would go about some of these steps. So we can go on to the next slide. And looking forward, we anticipate that the use cases will that will be used to pilot the blueprint and the PC-CIS creation are going to be really valuable tools. First, the best way to really ensure that the blueprint is as helpful and complete as possible is for folks to use it. Tell us if anything is missing. What's most valuable? Is anything challenging? Is there anything we can add or flesh out? And so there's no way to gather that insight except for having folks use it. Second, just getting a sense for variability in application. Some of the comments we've received so far have really been rooted in this notion of potential variability. So how does the path for a rare or ultra rare disease community compare to the path for a common disease? How different will the experience be for a community that has, little or no already collected data versus a group like the Arthritis Foundation, who, as I just noted, had quite a bit of collected data? Maybe how the process and the resulting core impact set could vary between a US-based or US-focused patient group and international groups. And we anticipate that the diversity in the applications of the blueprint and then the resulting core impact sets will generate a great deal of learning. And so we really look forward to that. Of course, we expect that as groups use the blueprint and develop their own core impact sets, they will identify needs for additional resources or maybe even stumble upon something that was valuable to them that we may want to include in the trove of resources. And then lastly, but certainly not least, is just the value of having this community of use cases. These are groups who can share lessons learned, share their success stories, all of which will serve as great resources to future users of the blueprint and creators of patient-centered core impact sets. So we have a break coming up, but it looks like we've got some questions coming in. And so I might open this up to my fellow colleagues and panelists. Let's see, I see a question here, and is it okay for me to just read this? I'll go ahead and do that. 2 questions. This would seem to work better by speaking to caregivers in people with critical illnesses with poor prognosis. And then the second question is, priorities for patients can change over time. For example, immediately post-surgery challenges are different than challenges 1 year out. How do we capture this? So maybe starting with that first question, Eleanor, I don't know if you want to jump in with some thoughts, and then maybe I'll go after you.
Yeah, Suze, I'm also seeing some different questions than the ones that you are reading off, so perhaps we can address some of those too. Could you repeat your first question again? I'm not seeing that one.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, I'll read it again. This would seem to work better. So I think collecting data, partnership, et cetera, by speaking to caregivers in people with critical illness and poor prognosis?
I think it's always important to speak to caregivers, and it's always important to speak to family members, but we also have to be mindful of the fact that these individuals don't speak for the patient. They are speaking about their own experiences and their observations. And that's very important information to consider in all of this, but it is also important to speak to patients to collect their information. And the caregivers and others can fill in the gaps, especially when someone cannot speak for themselves. But I think it is always important to be mindful that they can't speak for the experience of the patient. They can speak to what they observe. They can report what a patient might tell them, and it always has to be used in that context.
Great. Thanks so much, Eleanor. And the second question there before we go to the others was priorities for patients can change over time. So for example, immediately post-surgery challenges are different than challenges 1 year out. How do we capture this? And I think that's an important component of that variability I was speaking about. We think about a core impact set as being somewhat universal to a patient community, but recognizing depending on what segment of the community we're focused on or particular characteristics of that community, there might be differences. And actually in the arthritis use case, there are some key differences among people who have longstanding disease versus people who have more recently diagnosed disease. So it's an important point. And I think we're going to learn more about how the tool can be used and potentially massaged depending on those applicability differences and variabilities.
Yeah, I agree with that, Suze. I think there's also a few questions in the Q&A. Those were the ones that I was seeing. So there was a question asked, who is this aimed at? Patient advocacy groups, individual patients, individual physicians, pharma. So I think I want to tackle that question with two different pieces. One is who is a PC-CIS aimed at? So the core impact itself, that would be aimed at anyone who could use that to inform what they're doing. So it could be that the patient advocacy group wants to inform their programs or the work that they're doing. Pharma might want to use it to inform their clinical development plans, particular protocols, selection of endpoints. Individual physicians or groups of physicians might want to use it in terms of thinking about clinical practice guidelines and those kinds of things. So there are many different uses depending upon the activity that audience is involved in and how they might use it to inform that activity. In terms of the blueprint itself is aimed at the patient community. So that could be patient advocacy organizations, or it could be other formal or semi-formal patient communities that are out there that might have the ability to gather this kind of information from a patient population. Most typically, we would think of it as patient advocacy groups, but it could be others. And we're thinking about this as driven by the patient community because we want to see the patient voice be kept first and foremost throughout the process. Suze, you want to add anything to that?
I think you covered it perfectly, Eleanor. I think the idea is that this will be used in as many settings and for as many purposes as possible. It's just that patients really need to be at the helm. And so I think the way this will play out, I hope will just be a thousand flowers blooming, I think is how they say it. So I think there's a lot of utility here.
And when you say at the helm, I think it means that no one gets excluded. Everyone should be invited to participate, especially if they have a really critical role. But I think it's that there's patient community leadership bringing all of the different components to the table, where in the past, it's been somebody else who's been trying to lead this, and they've been inviting the patient community. Sometimes not, and that's a problem, but typically inviting the patient community to the table instead of the patient community being the leadership. And I think that's an important difference that we're seeing with this work. We also have another question about funding to develop core impact sets. And as we point out in the blueprint document, there will be resources required to do this. And some will require more resources than others because it depends on their starting point. If they're starting with a blank slate, they'll require more resources than if they're starting with some vast volumes of data that they've been collecting for years. But what resources will be required? We've suggested in the document some different sources. Someone might turn to industry partners, as is indicated in the question, going to PCORI when PCORI has those kinds of funding opportunities available, seeking government funding, maybe through organizations like ARC or NIH, in collaboration with others who might be going after funding along those lines. So it's going to have to take a variety of different revenue sources and some creativity to figure out how all the resources get pulled together to do this. But there's going to have to be lots of creative thinking about that. And we've made suggestions in the blueprint document on places to go. There's another question about patient-focused drug development and the summaries, the voice of the patient reports that come out from those patient-focused drug development meetings being included in this tool. And frankly, that's where we started. We thought of that as one starting point, that if you had a report, a voice of the patient report from a patient-focused drug development meeting, how would you abstract from that report the information that patients told whoever was leading that effort? And how would you pull that out, and how would you use it? And how would you get to what's most important? And so, yes, we very much see those kinds of documents as being very important starting points.
I would just add to that, part of the evaluation process when you are looking at existing data and wanting to make sure it really captures, again, what patients reported and what patients shared versus someone else's perspective on what patients experience. I think overwhelmingly patient-focused drug development initiatives have been very patient-centered, but it would be worth exploring the methods used. I know for the two that the Arthritis Foundation did, they were very there was very much an authentic partnership with patients. There were patients helping lead on the advisory committee, drive each aspect of data collection, drive each aspect of the day of the convening. And so it's just always important when you're looking at those existing data sources to make sure that that you can trust that this is truly what patients communicated, how they feel, what they experience. And so it's certainly a great place to start and just make sure that the data feels trustworthy from that perspective.
Suze, the next question is tied to that because it says there's an inherent bias in the way priorities are being, is there an inherent bias in the way priorities are being captured, given that specific demographics are a vocal part of advocacy organizations? And I think that's a terrific question. I think I want to clarify that we're not suggesting that in patient community leadership or in patient advocacy group leadership, that they be the only source of data. We're suggesting that they be capturing, those organizations would be capturing information from a wide variety of representative patients. And we do stress the diversity, inclusion, and representativeness in the blueprint, that it wouldn't just be the opinions of people who work for or are members of a patient advocacy organization. It would be the organization that would be going out and being sure that a good job is being done of collecting diverse and representative information. I think we're at the end of the questions that we've got here, so maybe we can jump to the break a little early if there aren't any other questions. I may be wrong in not seeing any other questions.
There's one more that came into the chat function. I'm not sure
Okay.
how, but I'll read that one out loud. Happy to hear you mention the rare and ultra rare patient communities. The process seems overwhelming and daunting for small organizations who are already stretched for funding, resources, sustainability, etc. Any recommendations or guidance for how to begin this kind of process when there are no resources or expertise? And I think this again speaks to that sort of variability question. And I think we're going to learn a lot through use cases with rare or ultra rare communities using these tools. I think one of the kind of principles that comes through the blueprint is the idea of collaboration. And so who can you collaborate with who maybe has a vision for how to move a project like this forward? I think that no one does that better than rare and ultra rare diseases. I think they really show us all the value and proof of collaboration. So I think that would probably be one kind of factor to consider. In terms of resources, I mean, I think there's similar financial resources to what Dr. Perfetto just mentioned. All of those same funders, maybe with the exception of industry, that can be a little more difficult. But I would look financially for the same resources. And I think if you look through the blueprint, my hope is that there's utility in what's provided there, regardless of rare or common disease. But Eleanor, weigh in. Are there things I'm not
Yeah, I
thinking?
think there are some ideas in the blueprint, but I also think, as you said, it's the rare disease community that's been so creative about tapping into and doing things with nothing. And I think thinking along those same lines, that creativity, outreach to partners or potential partners, people in academia who have an interest in the area that you work in, or people who might be local at a university or college nearby that have a skill set. Very often they're looking for collaborators, they're looking for partnerships, and they may be able to help by voluntarily helping with some things in order to help get future funding that they would be involved in, so that collaboration could grow. It's being creative along those lines to think about how you do some of this, but you're probably already using resources to connect with your community virtually. That's also a way that you can collect the data to make it less expensive and less onerous. So, as Sue said earlier, it's tying those threads together that you've always been tying together to get the work done that you do every day.
Absolutely. And actually, Annie Kennedy put in the chat, it's the Every Life Rare Giving funding could be used to support these efforts. So that's a great resource. Thank you for sharing that. Okay, I think there's one more question. Are
Okay.
there suggestions of potential sources of data included in the toolkit? And yes, there are quite a few. We look forward to the pilot cases because I think we'll learn about even more, but definitely multiple examples of the types of data you might look
And
to.
one of them was mentioned earlier, patient-focused drug development, voice of the patient report, always a great place to start. We always see those reports as a toe in the water. It's starting to collect the information and helping you figure out what to do next.